Hey, it's Vicky, and today I'm here to talk about the books that I read in November. November was a pretty good month, just life-wise. My daughter turned 9, and of course we had the Thanksgiving holiday at the end of the month. Austin and I also went to see Metallica in concert in Detroit, and it was a really great show. We had a really good time. So all in all, I think November was a good month. Reading wise, it was interesting. I had 2 5-star reads, which I don't know if that has ever happened yet this year. So I had 2 5-star reads, and I read 8 books total, which is pretty average for me. I did 3 print books, 1 ebook, and 4 audiobooks, and I think that's the first time also that audiobooks has outnumbered print books. So also just interesting. So let's just dive into the wrap up. So the first book that I completed in November is one that I've already talked about in a reading vlog. I read Douglas Adams' The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I did this for my 100 Epic Reads project that I've been doing here on my channel. And yeah, so I'm not gonna go deep into my thoughts on this book, but I will say I gave it 3 stars. And for a sci-fi book, I think that's pretty good for me because sci-fi is not usually my genre. But if you want my deep thoughts on this, go check out that vlog. Next up in November, I wanted to read some nonfiction for Nonfiction November. So the first nonfiction book I completed in November was Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson. And this is basically, it's kind of part memoir in many ways because Bryan Stevenson is an attorney who his focus is on representing people that have been convicted of crimes and that are on death row or are facing life sentences, and he basically is trying to help them reopen their cases or to, you know, be set free. And so this book touches on kind of how he got to that point in his career and how he started the Equal Justice Initiative, which is the practice that he runs that helps these types of clients. And he talks a little bit just, yeah, about himself and about the, you know, different clients that he has had throughout his years. The main focus in this one was his client named Walter McMillan, who was convicted of murder. Though he did not commit the crime, he had a pretty solid alibi, but he was still convicted and he was on death row. And yeah, this book was very, very well written, and it really tugs at your heartstrings. It's very emotional. The stories that you hear in here are just very heartbreaking and upsetting that our criminal justice system has a lot of problems, basically, and a lot of that stems from, in this case, with the types of cases that are talked about in this book, it stems from racism. This was a great book. I loved it. I really did. But like I said, it makes you angry, it makes you sad, but it also makes you sort of inspired that people like Bryan Stevenson exist. And I love that the Equal Justice Initiative is around to help these people, but it's also very sad that they have to even exist. That our criminal justice system is so messed up that there are groups that have to focus on getting wrongly convicted people off of death row and out of life sentences. So yeah, very well done. If you're at all interested in like social justice topics and things like that, you should definitely check this out. I gave it 5 stars. Next, I read a highly anticipated read for me, a new release that came out in October. I read Midnight is the Darkest Hour by Ashley Winstead, and this is it's marketed as a thriller, but I think it's more of a mystery novel. Because honestly, there wasn't a whole lot of thrilling things about this book. It deals with our main character, whose name is Ruth, and she lives in this small town in Louisiana. And her father is the preacher in the town, and they're a very religious group, community. And one day, a skeleton, I can't remember if it was a whole skeleton or just a skull, is found in the swamp area of their community. So they start investigating, like, whose skull is this? What happened to them? Was there foul play? Yada yada. And it sort of opens up this whole thing. It also has a bit of a romance because Ruth befriends this this guy named, oh my God, Everett? Yeah, his name's Everett. I almost said Emmett, but it's not Emmett, it's Everett. And they sort of have a little bit of a romance. And so yeah, it's about small town, secrets, small town, drama. It talks obviously a lot about religion. So my thoughts on this are basically I was very underwhelmed by this one, especially because I picked this up because the last Ashley Winstead book that I read, her last release, The Last Housewife, was a 5-star read for me, which was like to me a big deal because I don't normally give thrillers 5 stars. It takes a lot for that genre to get a 5-star from me, and so I was so excited about this one. And it was underwhelming because the story was very slow, like, and not in a good way. It was not a slow burn in a good way. It was slow in a bad way. I was wishing things would move along a bit. Yeah, there was just so much about this that I just wanted more. I wanted more from, which is weird for me to say, but I wanted more from the romance aspect. I felt that was very sort of slow and boring. The story itself, the ending was very abrupt and just meh for me. By the time the book came to an end, I didn't really care as much about what happened to the characters. And then the other thing that I think, the thing that was probably my biggest gripe about this was a lot of the story, I would say probably half of this book is told in flashbacks. And I felt like so many of the flashbacks were completely unnecessary, and also they were out of order. And I found that to be sort of confusing at times because there were times where it would go back in time and Ruth was 15. And then it would go back to when she's 18, and then back to when she's 11, and then back to when she's 16. And it just, the back and forth, and it was, almost every other chapter was this flashback. I didn't like it. I kind of wanted to stay in the present more. I don't know. And then just, yeah, the whole reveal of the big secrets in the town once everything was out in the open and revealed, I found it to be just very, very predictable. There was nothing shocking to me about it at all. And so I'm giving this book 3 stars, which by this review you'd think I would have given it a lower rating, but what made it a 3 was the writing was still really, really good. I had passages where, yeah, I did, underline them or something because I was like, wow, that's just like a really good piece of writing. So like an example of the good writing that I liked, there's a little section here that says, laws, religion, civil society, they were just veneers, constructions put in place by the powerful to tame us animals, impose control. Over so many years we'd forgotten, treating the constructions like they were part of nature, but nature doesn't know good or evil. All nature knows is survival. How terrifying and freeing that right and wrong aren't laws in stone, but navigational instincts, like the kind of instinct a swallow feels for its place in murmuration, like what guides geese north on a dark and starless night. So the writing was great, so that's why it still got 3. Otherwise, it would have probably been a 2. So yeah, I was a little bummed out by this one. Yeah, underwhelmed, 3 stars. Then I read another meh book, and it was another nonfiction book. I read The Devil in the White City by Erik Larson. This is one that I've had on my shelves for quite a while, and it's a very popular nonfiction book, so that's why I kind of wanted to check it off my list. And this one, it's sort of 2 books in one, and I think for me that was part of the problem. Why it was a little meh was because on the one hand, the story is about the 1893 Chicago World's Fair and how it came to be, and how they were able to lock in being able the ones to build the fair, and then the actual construction and architecture and all the things that went into putting this fair together was one part of the book. And then the other part of the book was all about H.H. Holmes, who is a known serial killer who during this time, during the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, he owned a very large house slash business right in the sort of heart of that area, and a lot of his victims, they believe, came from the World's Fair. And he was a very bad man, did very terrible things, and his house was super, super crazy. So for me, This book, the World's Fair stuff wasn't all that interesting. What kept me hanging on was the H.H. Holmes stuff. So looking back, I should have probably just read a book about H.H. Holmes, right? Because I'm sure they're out there. But I just kept going with this one. And so for me, half of the book was kind of boring and the other half was great. So, because I do think Erik Larson obviously did a fantastic job of researching these things and writing it in a way that is engaging. I just feel like that sort of topic, architecture and construction and business things just doesn't really interest me that much. Serial killers, yeah, they're pretty interesting. So for me, it was just sort of a matter of my personal taste. So I gave this 3 stars because, like I said, one side of it was okay and another side was great. So it sort of evened out to be a 3. And I listened to this one on audio, so I would definitely recommend doing that because audiobook was really good. My next November read was Another Brooklyn by Jacqueline Woodson. And this is, I've lost track of how many Jacqueline Woodson books I've read. There's been quite a few. She tends to write middle grade and like YA stuff, but this one is geared towards adults. And so that's why I wanted to check it out. And this one is about a woman named August, and she lives in Brooklyn. And one day she's on the subway and she sees a woman that she was dear friends with in like her late childhood and teenage years, and it sort of brings back that time in her life, and she starts to really like think about it, reflect, and it takes you back to that time, which was like 1970s Brooklyn. And so this book for me was great because it had a lot of coming of age elements, because it is about August and her friendship with these 3 other girls that she meets right at the end, really, of childhood, and they sort of go through adolescence together. And that's such a tumultuous, crazy emotional time, I think, for a lot of people, especially girls, and especially those like female friendships, I think, really go through a change during that time of life. And so this book, looked into all of that and examined it, and I thought it was so well done. Jacqueline Woodson's writing in here was great. I have no complaints about this, really. It's very short. It's under 200 pages, so I read it pretty quickly, and I highly recommend it. I gave it 4 stars. Then I read my other 5-star read for the month of November, and it sort of came as a surprise, sort of not. Because I've read a book from this author before. This was my second time reading this author, and the first book I read from this author was also a 5-star read. So I was kind of not sure if lightning was gonna strike twice, but it did. And that book is The Good Daughter by Karen Slaughter. And this one is about a woman named Charlie who is an attorney. In the prologue, you meet Charlie when she is 13 years old. And when she was 13 years old, this terrible traumatic thing happened to her family. Her father, who was also an attorney, a defense attorney, they had some intruders come into their home one evening, and her mother was killed, and it was just very violent, very traumatic. And so now in the present day, it's almost 30 years later, and Charlie is, like I said, an attorney, like her father, and she is involved in something else that happens that is also very traumatic, and it sort of brings back a lot of things for her and her family. And this book really surprised me in terms of how much emotion it brought out of me. There's a particular section in here that I won't go into detail, but I will say it was pretty far into the book. I want to say 3/4 of the way maybe, that completely gutted me. I was reading it and crying, which rarely happens with me, but it was so traumatic as the reader to read this particular scene. It just breaks your heart. And also this book, I feel, for being like it's kind of like a legal thriller in many ways, but it also had so much like family drama, and there was so much to this family and what happened to them in the past and how it's affecting them now. And I loved that Karen Slaughter took the time to really dive deep into that and into the relationships between the family members and how that terrible event affected them, and how it affected not only the relationship with each other, but how they relate to other people. And just because you don't often get that with legal thrillers or mysteries, it's more plot driven, it's more about, you know, solving the mystery or whatever. And this one, it wasn't. For me, the plot was like, it took a back seat. I cared more about these characters and what happened to them and how they relate to each other. And it was very emotional and just so well done. So like I said, lightning struck twice. Karen Slaughter got me again, and this was a 5-star read. I absolutely loved it. But I should note that this one does contain a lot of trigger warnings, and if you want to know about those, you should definitely look into it before you start reading, because it gets pretty intense, which Karen Slaughter is known for. But if you are sensitive to those things, you should definitely check that out before you start reading. But yes, I highly recommend it. 5 stars. I loved it. Then I read Everything's Eventual by Stephen King. This is a short story collection. It has 14 short stories in it. And you know, I think in my TBR video when I talked about this, I was like, yeah, you know, there's probably going to be 1 or 2 5 stars, 1 or 2, you know, 2 stars, and then the rest are going to be okay. And actually that wasn't entirely the case. There were 2 stories that got 2.5 stars from me that just didn't do it for me at all. But there were no 5 stars. I didn't give any of the stories in here 5 stars. But I think overall as a collection, I feel like for me, enjoyment-wise, it was one of his better ones because there wasn't such a big disparity between some of the stories. I would say the majority of the stories in here were 3 or 4 stars. So it averaged out, because when I do a short story collection, when I review them, I rate every single story and then do an average, and this averaged out to a 3. So not terrible, but like I said, he has worse collections in my opinion. But for me, the standouts in here, there were 3. And all of these stories got 4 stars from me. They were The Little Sisters of Illyria, which was a Dark Tower related story. So you are with Roland of Gilead, who is the main character in his Dark Tower series, and you have a little story about him, which was great. I also really enjoyed 1408, which is basically about a haunted hotel room. And then Riding the Bullet was about hitchhiking gone weird, we'll just say. So those 3 were the standouts for me. They were all 4 stars. They were good. Yeah, so I mean, this sort of went how I expected it to, but it was all right. So I'm glad I read it. I'm glad I can check it off my list and move on to my next Stephen King book. But yeah, this was a 3-star collection. Then I finished out the month by reading The Children on the Hill by Jennifer McMahon. And this one is a Frankenstein. It's pitched as a Frankenstein retelling. And I wouldn't necessarily call it that because the story is completely different. But I would say it definitely draws a lot of its themes and some of the like imagery from Frankenstein. And it deals with there's 2 timelines. So the first timeline takes place in the 1970s, and we are following a little girl named Vi who lives with her grandmother and her brother. And her grandmother is a therapist. And one day she brings home this little girl, Iris, who was a patient of hers, and she's decided to take her in. So the 3 children really start to bond together and all of that. And Iris is sort of quiet. She has a lot of memory loss. Like, she doesn't remember really anything about her time before coming to live with them. And so there's sort of some mystery around this little girl. And then in the present day, you are with a woman named Lizzie, who is a podcast host. She hosts a podcast that deals with monsters and hunting monsters and sort of folklore, urban legends, all that kind of stuff. And she is doing an investigation on the disappearance of this teenage girl who people in her town think some sort of monster took her. So those are sort of the two storylines, and obviously you learn as you go how they're connected. In this one, I feel sort of conflicted on this, and my rating sort of reflects it. I gave it a 3 because it was sort of middle of the road for me. I liked the ties to Frankenstein and some of the ideas about, you know, what makes a monster and all of that, but there was also part of it that I've just felt sort of disconnected from, especially the characters. Specifically, actually I can't say really either one. They both timelines I felt sort of disconnected from the characters. The timeline with the kids, for me, it was a little bit too childlike, which is weird because normally I love horror stories that come from a kid's perspective. But for some reason in this one, it just didn't hit right. And then so there was just sort of all around from all the characters, I felt sort of a disconnect. And then also the sort of twist was good. It was good and I liked it, but I also feel like it's been done many times. So it didn't feel entirely original, but it was still a good twist. So overall, I liked this, but it like wasn't amazing. So I gave it 3 stars, but I definitely, you know, still want to read more Jennifer McMahon. I actually have her newest book on my TBR for this month. So hopefully that one will be a little better than this one was. But yeah, I didn't hate this. I didn't love it either. It's one that I think I will definitely just sort of forget about, but it was a good read while I was reading it. All right, guys, so those are the books I read in November. It was a pretty like month. Other than the 2 5-star reads, I feel like it was kind of just like mediocre, but it's okay. It's fine. It happens. Let me know down below what you read in November. I would love to know if you read anything for nonfiction November. And I think that's it. So I hope you guys had a great month and I will chat with you soon. Thank you so much for watching.